Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and as you all know, I took the day off from narrating a video earlier this week, and I thought, well, if I was going to go for two, I would have to barf up a lung, so I made the time off count, and now I'm back. We're in Chicago, and we're returning to Chicago to examine some of the spectacular towers that we didn't look at in our first exploration. The first exploration really examined what Chicago looked like in the so-called official historical account that we have concerning Chicago and how this city began its meteoric rise. So back to Chicago, and here in this wonderful inspirational depiction from 1820, we can see that there were some very small structures and some very colossal Native Americans in canoes. I think I see Daniel Day-Lewis and Wes Studi. Moving on, Chicago started with Fort Dearborn, a geometrically precise foundation structure. And while it may be a rudimentary geometrically precise foundation structure, it is a GPFS nonetheless. And of course it started in Fort Dearborn. We have other depictions that indicate in the original map of Chicago from the 1830s that they already had the grid pattern set up for it, but very few structures within that grid pattern. And as some commenter nicely suggested, well, what exactly does that prove? Well, nothing, I guess, except for the fact that it seems as though someone knew that they were going to lay out a very elaborate and incredible city. In fact, one of the largest cities in the United States, even in that early time frame. So no, it doesn't prove anything. And yes, see, John, I plotted your office right there in the original plot of Chicago. John was an old collaborator back in my teaching days, and I just thought I would let him know that I haven't forgotten about him and show him where his office would be in Chicago from the 1830s. Isn't this an intriguing depiction here? We already have blocks laid out in this very rudimentary and infant city. But once again, it's as though they already knew that this was just going to be an incredible city, built along the river and built along Lake Michigan, and laid out in a way that would appeal to many people and bring many immigrants, people who would want to settle here. Taking another look at Fort Dearborn, that geometrically precise foundation structure. And again, while it may be rudimentary, it does show those signs of being a geometrically precise foundation structure. What are we not seeing in Chicago is a question I always have to ask. Well, look at that. Garden for fort. The garden for the fort is larger than the fort itself. Why would that be? Now, I know this is just a map, it's a depiction, it doesn't prove anything, but once again, it raises more questions. And look, you just have every little house right there depicted off the river. Population 350. And how fast did Chicago grow? Well, remember, 1830s to 1872 when we had our first major conflagration. And now we go to the subject of our exploration, the stellar towers, the incredible towers that all happen to be built in the 1920s. In fact, at the end of this exploration, you'll be thinking that the entire city was actually built in the 1920s. And in some of these images that we're told are from the 1920s and 1930s, we see a very impressive and well-developed skyline within Chicago. Quite extraordinary that it almost looks the same as it does now. Of course, we're missing some of the beautiful, sarcasm level 10 in Aurelian sarcasm meter, modern buildings, but you can see that the older buildings certainly dotted the skyline quite well and quite effectively. Not only that, they were very artistically inspired. Here we have some of them, the Pure Oil Building, the Union Carbide Building, we'll be taking a look at that, Mather Tower, London Guarantee Building, the Tribune Tower, and the Medina Athletic Club. We'll be getting to the Wrigley Building later. All these images, though, give us the impression that this has always been a city that reached to the sky. And there's always been that supposed competition between Chicago and New York City. New York City, of course, being snubbed for the World's Fair in the 1890s. They've never let go of that one. You look at some of the other images of Chicago and you get the impression of a very well-developed infrastructure. And once again, Chicago's impressive because of the fact that we saw all it was, at least all it was depicted as being, in 1833. Here's the Lexington Hotel from 1905. Once again, another impressive hotel. And we can see some of the forms of transportation at that time, with the trolleys, the streetcars, or whatever you call them in whatever city you're in. And we look at some of the other impressive skyscrapers. They look a little advanced for their time. Also in their layout and the actual construction materials, and look at how well developed the foundation of the city is, even in these early years, as though they had planned for parking space in multiple levels. Quite fascinating. Ah, yes. Here we have one of our very convincing construction photos, showing us beyond any shadow of a doubt that, yes indeed, our civilization constructed these buildings, and there's no reason to question any of these photos, so we'll move on. And here you can see some of the other buildings laid out on the skyline on this postcard, and it's very impressive. Now that's the Carbide and Carbon building. The pure oil building we're going to be looking at in a separate exploration. There's a couple interesting mysteries we need to unpack with that particular building. Yes, another wondrous construction photo, and once again not creating any more questions than it answers. I think I'm satisfied. Maybe we should just close the book on this exploration right now. But I think you all know I'm not easily satisfied by photographs, and no one else should be either. They don't necessarily prove anything, and they don't disprove anything, but they do offer clues. Very impressive set of buildings and very unique architecture that we see. They seem to vary quite a bit. Yet looking at that older skyline, we see that there is a beauty to it, a more natural and organic beauty than what we see with our current skyline, and certainly a lot less square shapes. Ah, yes, we have a Zeppelin, and not just any Zeppelin, but the Graf Zeppelin as it flew over Chicago. Very intriguing image, and we can see that the skyline was already pretty well developed at that time, along with the beauty of the Graf Zeppelin going over it. And a slightly closer image, although I couldn't find a better photograph, and I wonder why that was. Zeppelins are very impressive with their travel capability. Officially, it took 21 days for the Graf Zeppelin to complete its circumnavigation of the world, and yes, 21 days. There are rumors that it took 24 hours, but those are just rumors, so pay no attention to them. Very interesting, though, looking at these early images as though it conveys a completely different world. And we'll be told it's just the past. And yes, it's just the past. And Chicago has its own Union Station as well. And a very unique Union Station at that. Off of the river, and yet when you look at the bridges and the other buildings, you can see a very well-developed and well-planned infrastructure. Question is, when did they really start planning it? And look at this, the Palmer House. Very beautiful building with pediments and columns built in the walls. And of course it has a dome, because you just don't have a real good building without a dome and portal windows on it. These are some very unique images in how they convey the images of Chicago. And most of these buildings, if not all, are still standing to this day. And you can see them quite well depending on which modern building you stand on in Chicago. But one thing we know about modern buildings, at least the contemporary buildings that we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that our civilization built, is that they have a lot of unusable space in them. Well, let's take a look more directly at Chicago. Here's the Women's Temple Building, or the Women's Temple Building, built in 1905. Quite an impressive Women's Temple Building. And what exactly was a Women's Temple Building? Has anybody heard of that? Could you let me know in the comments? We'll start by looking at the Carbide and Carbon building, built 1928 to 1929, a one-year wonder, and it's over 500 feet tall. And we can see that it's adorned with what they tell us is black granite. I'm often getting to the point, though, where I'm questioning what the actual construction material on these buildings really, truly is in all these cases. Because while we're told this is black granite, it's interesting to consider how black granite is laid out in what they tell us is a quote-unquote terracotta building, or whatever architectural style they're trying to sell us that this particular building is. Very unique top on the building, and it reminds me of some of the structures that I recall seeing in Kansas City, and also structures that I've seen in other major cities. It's intriguing when we think about these building booms that we have in the 1920s across the United States. Of course, it should be noted the United States had multiple building booms. A building boom that occurred before 1929, and a building boom that occurred after 1929 during the Great Depression. Because, the United States didn't sink deeper in the Great Depression, at least not when it came to buildings. They still managed to complete many wondrous Art Deco buildings. And it seems as though the entire skyline of Chicago just happened to be completed before then. You can see this Carbon and Carbide building, or Carbide and Carbon building, very interesting title, as it stands out with the other older buildings in the Chicago Loop skyline. Yet looking closer at the detail on the surface, this is very impressive. How wonderfully decorated it is, and the unique coloring. The Carbide and Carbon building. I don't know, maybe they get another C in there and it could be a 3C building. The coloring, though, is unique how it changes with the various lighting. That's always something that impresses me about these older buildings, and I think that's what gives them a unique beauty and artistic appreciation that we just don't have with the modern glass and steel skyscrapers that we have. And look at all the designs and ornate detail that goes all the way to the top floor. And once again, it feels like there is not a square inch of usable space with this building that is wasted. So even though we have the modern buildings around it that may be taller, how much of that space is actually usable? And remember, how durable are these buildings? That's another question we have to ask. Which one would stand up to all the natural disasters that seem to plague our society, or our current civilization, as our media no doubts ever forgets to remind us each and every day? Interesting image here, supposedly from the 1940s, 1950s. Couldn't get an exact date on it. But this is very impressive just looking up at the building, and didn't do any zooming on this image because I just wanted you to appreciate what it would be like just to look up at this building. And of course we have the other factor of modern buildings surrounding these older buildings and obscuring their detail. The interior is once again just incredibly majestic. All of the artistic and ornate decoration that goes on within these buildings. And to me, this is the real sign that you can ascertain that these buildings are truly from the old world. And I think this is what really stood out to me about the Art Deco buildings, that didn't seem like they came from our civilization. So built within a year by our civilization. Now let's be kind and say that's true. How exactly did they complete all this decorative detail in a year? All the artisans and craftsmen that we just had all over the place. And keep in mind that every other city was building many buildings at the exact same time as this one. We looked at them in Detroit and Indianapolis and Kansas City. How exactly were they able to pull this off in such a short amount of time? Just consider that, the construction timeline of 1 year. It's not just the exterior of the building, it's this very impressive interior, where you have brass and granite and everything else. Well, let's go on to the Chicago Daily News Riverside Plaza building from 1929. Not exactly sure what the construction timeline on this one was because there were some mixed accounts, but this is considered one of the greatest Art Deco buildings in Chicago. And you can see it is well worthy of that sobriquet. Especially down towards the base and the foundation, because it looks like we have a little obelisk, but then when you look carefully you can see that fine detail. That's the touchstone of what we refer to as Art Deco. And even here with the Riverside Plaza clock, and you can see some of the details that give you the impression that this building is a lot older than maybe we're told. Of course, the explanation will be, it's Chicago and the air there gets a little dirty, and of course it can stain the building. It is very interesting, though, how there's a little different coloring there as you go up the building, and you wonder what the official account will tell us as to why that coloring changes. Yet the structure is very sturdy, and looking at different angles of this same building, we can see that they put a lot of effort into how they built the base and then moved up and built the tower portion of it. And this was just supposed to be for a newspaper, although there's conflicting accounts of that as well. Looking a little bit closer at the wall of the building and going up to the upper floors, and again you can get the hints of all those details that always accompany Art Deco. Once again, there's not a single inch of space that tends to be wasted. And then looking a little bit closer, where we can see supposedly some of the names that were carved into the side of the building along with some of the figures. Now, what exactly is the nature of this construction material? Is this just standard concrete, or is this a more advanced concrete? When I examined some of the Art Deco buildings in Kansas City, and I'm sure I would in Chicago, notice that this seems to be a slightly more advanced form of concrete. It seems to be more durable. It seems to be harder. I'm not going to go so far and suggest something radical as that this is Roman concrete, but this certainly has a lot of signs of Roman concrete. And once again, we have the very beautiful and artistic interior. Look at the way the walls are and the ceiling is decorated. And this is always the hallmark of these Art Deco buildings, and this is one of the reasons why they tend to stand out to us so much. And even when you look at more of the office section, you can still get that indication of the Art Deco, the way everything is decorated, from the pillars to the ceiling, and of course the elevators. Once again, leaving no detail untouched. And you get that feeling that when you're in this building, that you're in something from a time long past. The glory of something long forgotten, and yet still seen every day, that we'll just walk on past and not think twice of. And you're taking another look at these elevators, and I'm reminded of what we saw in other Art Deco buildings that we've seen across the land, whether it was in Buffalo, New York, or New York City, or Kansas City, or all the other explorations that we've done. You see it reflected here in Chicago just as well. Interesting, though, that they try to put these modern signs and banners in these Art Deco buildings, and I've noticed that seems to be a way that they try to, I'm not going to say degrade them, but I'm going to say it deteriorates our appreciation of them a little bit. At least they're trying to detract from that. What the heck's this? Riverside Plaza, Minneapolis, 1973? This looks like brutalist architecture. Wait a minute. How did brutalist architecture get in my presentation? Who is responsible for this? Yeah, Christopher Lambert. Coming back again for all those mispronunciations. Okay, look, I'm doing the best I can. I'll try to get it right. Okay? Okay. Let's go to the Chicago Temple Building, 1924. And like I said, it's as though all of Chicago was built in the 1920s, at least every single tower. Not before, not after, and not even during the 1930s, that second American building boom, but in the 1920s, the first American building boom. So really the best way to describe this is really just a cathedral, a basilica that's on a skyscraper. It's rather unique, and we think back to that wonderful cathedral that we saw, or that wonderful church in Ulm, Münster in Germany, which we're told competes for the title of tallest church with this one. Although that held the title because the entire building here in this tower was not used for religious purposes, or so we're told. Very impressive tower. And it's very unique when you have a church amalgamated with a building, and I'm starting to wonder if there were other old world buildings that had this appearance. The fact that this building still stands today is a testament that this was possible to do by somebody in some time frame. Therefore, it's safe to say that there were once other buildings like this. But when you look here at the cymatic window and the very well detailed entryway, you get that impression, yes, from the 1920s once again, and we're reminded of the Cathedral of Learning that we saw in Pittsburgh. Very impressive, though, and yet once again it's concealed by the other modern buildings, the towers of glass and steel, albeit not very durable steel, compared to what we have with what seems to be a more advanced concrete. And once again, you're seeing it with this building. And how was the tower formed? How exactly did they do it? Was it done sectionally and then they lifted it up with cranes? Is that what we're to believe? Very intriguing. In the interior, we have a unique layout and not something we'd expect to see for a religious building. Very interesting. Cross beams and wonderful decoration, and then all the colored windows. And then other aspects of it. And here this has reminded me more of the Cathedral of Learning, especially with all the arches and the sectional columns there that make up. And let's not forget about the ceiling and the floor and the materials that go into that as well. Very impressive structure that we're told is for religious purposes, but not entirely for religious purposes. But what are your thoughts on this incredible temple skyscraper building in Chicago? Let's take a look at Chicago Union Station, 1925, built in 6 minutes. And I joke about that because I really don't know. And the accounts are conflicting on this. And, you know, if somebody said in the official account and it was recorded and well documented, I'm sure everyone would believe that they could have pulled this off in 6 minutes. Well, much like the other Union stations that we've looked at across the land, there is no shortage of renovation going on with this, so it seems as though they're constantly altering and changing these buildings. A continuous process, and no doubt it does help with the employment efforts, as that's how it'll be justified. Here's the official grand opening of this Union Station in the 1920s, and we can see the spectacular columns and the vast, august body assembled for its dedication. Interesting statues here. And what exactly are these depicting? And consider what we've looked at with statues in our recent explorations, and what are they actually representing? Because it always seems hard to believe that this is really supposed to be conveying the United States and Chicago in the 1920s. Here was the original Union Station. Although, would this have really been something suitable for the large city of Chicago in the 1870s, at least as large as we were told? And remember how it started in the 1830s. Well, that's right. If a major city doesn't grow in 40 years, you get your money back. This is the United States. We can build cities in a very short amount of time. Look at the impressive columns here and the way the interior of this Union Station is laid out. And even with some of the renovations, you can still get an idea for what the ancient past glory was that still exists in this building, especially looking at the ceiling and the way it's integrated with the columns in this image. And looking at the older black and white image, and while it has a similar feeling to what we've had with the other Union stations, each of the Union stations that we've looked at, I will note, are very unique in their own way. And that shouldn't be surprising. Ah, yes, you may recognize this stairway if you've ever watched the movie The Untouchables or the movie Naked Gun 33 1/3, because this stairway gets featured in a lot of different films, and you can see why. I mean, could you have a stairway in a modern building you could film that scene on? No, it wouldn't work. and it appears in many postcards as well, so I think that gives us the final certification that this is a true Union Station, and it should be fully appreciated. Well, let's move on to the next building. And now we go to the London Guarantee Building, built in 1922. Again, the 1920s, the entire city of Chicago being built in the 1920s. And isn't this a very unique building with the cupola on top of it and then the pillars in the walls? By the way, did you know that this building was owned by Abe Froman, the Sausage King of Chicago? It's very well documented that Abe Froman, after he built his sausage empire in Chicago, purchased the London Guarantee Building. Yes, Abe Froman, Sausage King of Chicago, established in 1986. All right, back to the London Guarantee Building. Looking at the top of the cupola, we can see how it compares with the rest of the skyline. And once again, even in the skyline image, you get the impression of just how truly advanced and impressive this city was for its particular time frame. And yet some of the other images, and here we have our, once again, very convincing construction photo, and I think that just answers all the questions that we would possibly have about a structure like this. I mean, obviously we built this. It's a convincing image. Nothing more to see here. Once again, seeing the layout of the buildings on the Chicago Loop, and all of these older buildings, I think, are far more impressive than all of the modern skylines that we have in the United States. And that's just my opinion, but I think it's a pretty easy opinion to defend. Looking at this building from bottom to top, though, and you can see how the columns are integrated in towards the top, and then you have the cupola. And that's what makes the design rather unique, and you have to ask yourself, why wasn't this design used in other buildings? The interior, once again, no less impressive, with all the ornate detailing up in the high ceiling. And look at every bit of decorative detailing. The impressions and the reliefs and everything that stands out on that ceiling. And looking at it a little closer, and yes, you can go back and pause and read that sign there. It's quite interesting, especially when they talk about things being transmitted to us. What exactly does that mean? Really appreciate the beautiful designs, though, within it. And then looking at it from top to bottom and getting an appreciation for how exactly did they get those columns all the way up there and integrate them within the top of the building near the roof. And then looking at the entryway, which is no less grand in and of itself. And once again, I consider what the actual material was used in this building. It's just a little hard to believe that Portland cement would really suffice for keeping a building like this standing so long and as it's approaching its 100th birthday. And here you can even see it in the entryway, the doorway, the sign that feels rather tacked on with Fort Dearborn. But then looking above that, and then you see the grandeur within the columns and the arched entryway, and once again, the very impressive reliefs. And I find myself asking, how exactly did they do that? And our theory is that it was more of a scalar construction or a modular construction, and the pieces were prefabricated and then shipped to where they were needed across the land. But who knows for sure? You can see, though, that going towards the top of this impressive building, that once again, no detail was spared. Every single column is fully adorned, the walls have all the wonderful decorations on them, and it's an impressive building. And then looking at the cupola, and the cupola is unique in and of itself. And no, they're not ripping off from the mausoleum of Helicanarsis this time. What exactly is that sphere on the top all about? And look at how impressive those columns are. And the way it's lit at night is even more impressive, and it almost transitions you to another world when you look at these images. City of Chicago. Yes, how long has the city of Chicago truly been there? And whatever name it may have been under or been called in the past. Of course, I'm just talking about Fort Dearborn, right? Looking up towards the top, though, the cupola really stands out in a way that it makes you feel as though it's some sort of water temple. And here we go again with the interior of this building. Once again, no less impressive. Beautiful, well-decorated ceilings, each of these doors and the elevators appearing gold or brass, the walls and then the floor with a unique pattern within it. And then looking at that cupola, and you can see on the very top of the building that, once again, no square inch being spared for the illustrious detail, right down to the lines going up to the little ball on the top. And you can see even in the older images of this building that it was no less impressive in the past. And of course, you know, the construction images might have given the impression that it wasn't quite so impressive, but looking at the building once it was complete, it was indeed very impressive. Apparently they had a fire at some point in time, but how devastating of a fire was this really? Was this a true fire or was it a minor inconvenience? Well, the building's still standing today, so come to your own conclusions, as I'm fond of saying. Well, let's take a look at the James Am Nederlander Theater, 1926, Broadway in Chicago. Once again, another one of these very impressive city theaters that we always seem to come across in each of these cities, although it should be noted that this is not a Fox Theater. Yet, the interior once again shows us the very impressive, ornate details that we'd expect to see in one of the Fox theaters that you might recall we looked at during the Atlanta exploration. Unbelievable beauty, going from the ceiling and then even the entryway. It's just something that seems like it's out of a different world. The way every single pillar, the walls, the ceiling, and the floor are all decorated. As though they had all the time in the world in the 1920s to make this the most beautiful theater that you've ever seen in your life. And looking at the stage, you can see that once again, no expense, no detail was spared in bringing out the most elaborate artistic impressions looking at the theater. You don't even need to go there to see the show. You can just go there and admire these incredible visuals in person. And just imagine the materials and being able to examine this in person. And this is definitely on my list when I get on the ground in Chicago, which is scheduled for a time coming soon. But just looking at these images, though, it's truly impressive the way the patterns and the detail are factored into the walls all the way up to the ceiling. And how exactly did they pull this off? Was it somebody like Leonardo da Vinci on their back working for a couple years? I don't know. Or Michelangelo working on his head for 20 years? And yet we're told that they built this in a very short amount of time. Once again in the 1920s when they were building the rest of Chicago, it seems. Really, all these visuals just leave you speechless. And this is just something that I could really show and not have to provide any narration for, because I believe the pictures really tell the story in and of themselves. But of course, we can always provide a little bit of good narration, because you can see that with this entire theater, of course this is Broadway. This couldn't be anything less than Broadway. This couldn't be anything less than the most important show you've ever seen in your entire life. And it's extremely impressive. Principal Rooney had some problems, though, when he went to the theater to try to find out about a student who he believed was truant or skipping school. Now, of course, in his efforts to try to locate the student, Principal Rooney thought that he had found the student, but it turned out he found the wrong student. Well, in an effort to apologize to the student's family, there was a bit of a misunderstanding, and Mr. Rooney flipped a very obscene gesture, in which case a group of thugs came out of nowhere and brutally assaulted him. Although on closer investigation, it turns out that the thugs was merely one 16-year-old student who attended his high school, and she'd had some training in Taekwondo. All right, moving on. Looking at the Medina Athletic Club building, 1928 to 1929. Again, the 1920s, and again, another one-year wonder. And look at the top of this building. And what exactly is the sphere on top all about? This is a very unique appearing building, and this definitely has some futuristic implications to it. And from my perspective, there's something more futuristic appearing about this building than any of the modern buildings that we've seen that have been built in the 21st century. And it's even got some very impressive pools, as it's now an intercontinental hotel, of course, what else would it be, that are located on the upper floors. And we always talk about the old notoriums, and we consider that, and yet here in this Medina Athletic Club building that's now an intercontinental hotel, you can find these impressive pools on the higher floors. Again, it's just one of those things that's unbelievable in many different ways, but there's other unbelievable things when you look at all the impressive interiors within this building. This is an athletic club building? Well, what was really the intention? Now, of course, there's something in the official history about the Shriners and everything else, but are we to believe they were behind every single building in Chicago? There's also something interesting when you look on the outside of the building, because we see the classic Art Deco stylings. What exactly are these three figures here representing? What is this all about? Very impressive with the way that they seem to be holding the swords and then looking down on the rest of the building. The fact that they're integrated in the wall. Is that past, present, and future? I'm not sure. Now you can see those three figures from a little bit of a distance, and then you can see the relief below them. Just a very impressive building. And it should be noted that that Intercontinental Hotel takes the old Medina Athletic Club building, and then it takes everything else in it as well. But some of the stylings on this remind me of some of the other buildings that we've looked at in the other cities, namely Atlanta. And this is kind of the side to the United States that you just don't expect to see. And that's why I think it's important to do these explorations when we look at different cities, but also we look at different areas across the land. Because are we really seeing different architectural stylings? Or are we seeing one unified architectural styling that's being applied in different ways? Those are the questions we have to ask. And here we go again with the interior. And what exactly do you have here with these elevators, and then looking out at the entryway there, and then what appears to be a little bit of a display there underneath that arched entryway? Let's take a little closer look at that. Very impressive. And above each of the elevators with the decorative detailing, to say nothing of the painting and pictures and depictions on the wall. The murals, again, no detail being spared. And here again with another very impressive large audience room with a balcony and some columns that are very well decorated that match the most beautiful columns we've seen across the lands, and a chandelier. And yet another chandelier and lighting and columns that are integrated in the walls. And why not just throw in some very beautiful colored windows while you're at it too? So here you are again in the 1920s, no detail spared. And this building just really tells that story. It's as though within the interior of this building, you're getting an example of every single styling that's available. And it's unbelievably impressive. And I can't even put it in words what you're seeing here. And here we have a little bit of a lion relief image. A little bit of a lion that's integrated with the sun. Very interesting image, and yet you can see the details that are in it. And what material is that made out of exactly, I have to ask. Once again, looking at the exterior, though, with the depictions and the reliefs on it and the unique symbols, and I certainly invite you to tell me what you think, as always, in the comments about this particular building, because this is very unique, especially with the three figures that I'll just call past, present, and future up there. Looking at the pool again, and you can see that there is the very well decorated columns integrated with the walls, and you have a central display there. I have to say, I can see why this is a luxury hotel, because you really just feel like you're in luxury wherever you are, whether you're diving in the pool or you're just walking around to go to the elevators in the Continental. And the Intercontinental and the Continental hotels are always the nicest hotels that you can find in the United States, although some people will tell you that you can just take a good old Holiday Inn Express. Yes, someone please try to convince me that anything about a Holiday Inn Express would compare to what you're looking at right now, with this column and the beautiful decorations in the ceiling. Oh, and don't forget the paintings too. But then taking another look at that pool, and you're probably wondering, well, why is he going so crazy about the pool? Because this has to be one of the most decorated pools that I think I've ever seen in my time. I came across this nice young lady who told me that her best friend, sister's brother's boyfriend's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid who talked to his grandfather, whose great-grandfather confirmed that the building was indeed built by our civilization. So I guess we have to close the book on the Medina Athletic Club building. Well, let's move on to the next one. And here we have the Mather Tower, again built in 1928. Now, this might seem like a building that seems a little less impressive than the others, and yet there's something that seems more advanced and futuristic about it, especially again for the 1920s. And keep in mind all these buildings that were just tabbing up here in the 1920s in Chicago. We have a very impressive tower that's established on the top of this building. And it seems as though there was a little bit more effort put to make this one a little bit taller, although once again it's concealed by all the modern office buildings that we have in Chicago. And I'm noticing that seems to be a recurring phenomenon across all the great cities, especially in the United States. I lament how much the Plummer Building in Rochester, one of the most wondrous Art Deco buildings, is concealed by the other buildings. That's Rochester, Minnesota. We've also got some of these images in these drawings that give us an idea of what Chicago really looked like at the height of its glory. And there's nothing to be denied about how impressive Chicago is, especially in the 1920s. When you look at all the beautiful decorations that go into the top of this tower, and these are the kind of aspects that we just don't see in our modern square buildings that just end in nice 90-degree angles everywhere you look. But I consider the fact that there are details that come into how they erected this tower all the way to the top, and what kind of efforts they had to put into actually building it. What was the real building method behind it? And how was it actually designed? Because we can see in the older images just how truly impressive this tower was, and how it compared to the rest of the skyline at that time, before we surrounded it with glass and steel skyscrapers. And yet here in these other images, you get the impression of how these buildings all laid out together. And of course, I always ask the question, were there other buildings that were once standing that are no longer standing? Because when we look at our final building in this exploration, we have several examples of what those other buildings may have looked like. But these sketches are intriguing because they don't really show an idealized view of Chicago. It seems as though they're showing more of a realistic view. Let's look at the Metropolitan Tower, originally the Strauss building in 1924. Hey, wait a minute, the Strauss building? Is that the same Strauss that built the person's house in Cincinnati? Did Strauss also build this building all by himself in Chicago in the 1920s? Who is this Strauss? What is going on here with this top of the building and this interesting orb on it? And what are those figures? Are those buffalo? That's very intriguing when we consider the unique mixed account that we have of buffalo or bison in the United States. And once again, a little bit of a pyramid structure, although in Chicago apparently they call this the Beehive Building because that's supposed to be a beehive on top. I guess maybe just because it looks like that. Once again, we have the impressive pyramid top and the columns that have been lifted all the way to the top of the building, because how else would it be? Naturally, that's why you have to have this wonderful piece of modern art that resembles a chromatic excrement that's displayed out in front of these buildings, because, you might actually start to think you're in a different kind of city unless you had something like that. And you can see, looking at some of these skyline images, how these older skyscrapers are just hidden by all these new, lovely, modern buildings that all look the same, like they came off the conveyor belt, just like they were no doubt supposed to. But fortunately, we still have buildings like this that we can still look at and get an idea of the glories of the past. And what was really going on with the top here? Was this supposed to be some sort of signal device? Was this supposed to be an area for an offloading platform for airships? Could it have been both? Could it have had many other functions? I don't think we could really see any limitations to it, especially when the fact that we have the railing up there, and yet you have what appear to be bison, although I could be wrong about that. Once again, we look at the interior and we see the decorative detail that goes along with it. Very intricate patterns and arched ceilings, and the way everything is geometrically tied together. Looking at the building, though, from bottom to top, and again, looking at the construction materials, almost seeming like a more advanced concrete, something that holds together just like all those wondrous courthouses that we looked at in the explorations in Iowa. And yet on the inside of the building, you can see it's more the same thing. You have the very unique walls with the designs on the top of the walls and integrated into the ceiling. More effort being put into a single building. And then looking at the older images, and we have columns on the inside, and we have the impressions in the ceilings, and we have the impressions within the arches, because that's all just easy stuff to do. And when you're throwing up so many buildings in the 1920s, you were no doubt practiced at it. Well, now this building is being used for living space, and I guess that makes sense, and I'm sure for a very low, reasonable, and equitable price, you too can find yourself a living space in one of these wondrous old world towers. Well, let's take a break and look at the St. Nicholas Cathedral, Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral built 1906 to 1915. Coincidentally, the exact same years that they were building the Cathedral of St. Paul in St. Paul, Minnesota. What are the odds? And this is a very impressive building that will be told as Byzantine architecture. And for some reason, I'm reminded of the movie In the Mouth of Madness. I can't exactly imagine why. The good old onion domes that we associate with an empire that we're told never truly existed. It was always called the Roman Empire. But whatever you want to call it, look at the interior of this one. And here we have all the columns with the arches in beautiful decorative color. A Ukrainian Catholic cathedral. Much like we had a Polish Catholic cathedral up in Milwaukee, well, down in Chicago, you've got a Ukrainian Catholic cathedral. And look at the way some of the arches go, and these are more extensive arches on this, and the tight geometrical patterns leading up into the ceiling. There's even a Ukrainian village that this is apparently all part of. Now, I'd been through Chicago many times, and if there's one thing I hadn't heard of, at least prior to 2021, it was the existence of a Ukrainian village, but maybe I just went past it, because I'll admit I went past that Polish basilica, Catholic basilica in Milwaukee many times. But it's impressive how this structure contrasts with the other more modern structures that you saw in the distant skyline. And here you can see it within this Ukrainian village. You also get all the fine details that go within the various subsidiary towers, and it just wouldn't be a Catholic cathedral unless you had a very large schematic window. So what exactly is that reflective of? What was the original purpose and intention of this building? 1906 to 1915. Once again, impressive, and like I said before, it's a coincidence that they were building at the exact same time frame that they were building the Cathedral of St. Paul in St. Paul, Minnesota, which really wasn't all that far from this particular area. And of course, we have the scaffolding and the incessant renovations that go on with all these buildings, because I guess when they built them back in the early 20th century, they just didn't know what they were doing. But, now that we have more advanced construction techniques, we can renovate them more appropriately. So it would seem. There's other impressive buildings within this Ukrainian village, and definitely going to have to get and do some boots on the ground exploration with this, because this is very unique. I like the way the little area there protrudes. Very incredible coloring, though, when you look at this image. And this really reminds you that we live in a world that has so many different colors. It's not just the usual reflections that come out of the windows every day, or the nighttime lights and the glass and steel skyscrapers that we settle for now. I also see that in the ceiling you can see a bit of a dome-type structure, but then you can also see all the paintings and images that go on the inside of the cathedral. And of course it has the very beautiful stained windows. So how old is this, and what exactly is this from? Well, I leave it to you in the comments to let me know what you think, but it seems as though with buildings like this we have many different potential answers. Because this does hark back to one of the original explorations done on the channel when we looked at the Cathedral of Transfigurations, and special points if anybody knows where that's located. Hint, it was featured in the movie In the Mouth of Madness quite prominently. Look at the way with the designs of the arrangement of some of the bricks up there on the towers, with the onion domes. Very impressive and very unique. And just the way it contrasts with that skyline in the distance. And going back to the interior, and again, it's as though you get a different impression of the colors depending on the lighting, depending on the time of the day, and for us, that reflects something else from the old world. Well, let's go on to our last one, the Tribune Tower, 1923 to 1925, and we're told this is a neo-Gothic style. Yeah, it actually took them 2 whole years to build this one instead of a single year, probably because that neo-Gothic was a lot more complicated. And we do have some very convincing construction photos on this neo-Gothic Tribune Tower, of course, so once again I think this closes the book on the exploration, and it should answer all your questions, because these are wonderful photos, and they're very well done. Well, and here's another one. And I have to say, it's intriguing when you look at the so-called framework of the building and the way that they're establishing the exterior on that. Well, no problems with this photo either. So we'll just admire the building for what it is, and look at the entryway here and all the detail that went into this. Neo-Gothic, yes. Gothic is code for it's extremely detailed. There's no way we could do it now, but it was very easy to do in the past. But we're more advanced now than we were in the past. And don't question it. Looking right on up there, and you can see all that detailing in the archway above the main entry. Tribute Tower, although that feels like that was tacked on. I don't know why I would think that. And then looking at the very roof, and this is where you see all the beautiful ornate detail with this particular building. This is something that defies the explanations that were given that this was done in the 1920s, and I'm going to explain why. Because think of all the effort that went into establishing all this detail. Even a 2-year construction timeline seems unbelievably aggressive just for building the tower, the top of this building. How were they able to do this? Are we to believe that it was all carved, that it was all formed and then slowly carried up there, slowly carted in? It's one of the most impressive buildings I've seen, just in terms of the decorative, artistic inspiration that goes especially towards the roof. Oh, and as if that's not enough, we're also told that this building has stones from other major structures across the lands, whether it's Scotland or whether they snagged a rock out of the Lincoln Memorial. And I find it interesting that nobody had a problem. They were snagging rocks from other sites to put in this building. Well, that's what the official account tells us. Make of it what you will. And here's the original foundation. And once again, another great picture that doesn't create any more questions than it answers. Here's some of the other design schematics, though, for this building, or the proposals, because as usual, we have that old story that there was a competition, and this was one of the other entries. Oh, yes, a nice sphere on top of this building. Now, is that really what happened, or did that building actually exist and someone just did a sketch of it? Because you would think an artistic proposal would be a little bit more... never mind. I'm not even going to finish that. Yes, it's being used for living space, and I'm sure, once again, for a low economical price, you could find living space. Here's one of the featured maps in the main entry gallery of this Tribune Tower. And you can see it's a great depiction of North America. Quite fascinating how the Great Lakes are depicted. But look at this older image of it. What exactly is going on here? Does it look like something's missing on this old image of this map to you? I don't know, maybe I'm seeing things. And here we have the old clock face once again within the Tribune Tower. And we see we've got the 4 eyes, or the 4 ones, in Roman numerals. You don't need no IV for a 4 on these old clocks. Not at all. This is an impressive imagery of the main entryway with all of its decorative detail and series of arches. And as if that's not enough, they decorated the exterior of it too. Because, you had 2 whole years to build this building. And then looking up at these impressive images of the top of the building and getting a better idea for how the detailing went together. Here you have large arches, large towers that are all joined together with a central tower. And then you can see what they would tell us is the Gothic design stylings, but is that really what the purpose of the top of this building was? Again, something else that we have to ask, and I'm not settling for the initial explanation that we're given. And here's another one of these renderings, or another one of these entries, and I don't know, not quite as impressive as what we actually ended up with, but still an impressive building when compared to what we have today, if it did in fact exist. This is truly incredible when you look at this portion right here. This just seems very advanced, very elaborate, and of course they're going to tell us that this is Gothic, because what else could they tell us? They certainly couldn't tell us it was some modern E. Townsend mix design. And yes, here we see the familiar symbols once again, because this building just has everything integrated within it. Very impressive and very unique. And yet you look at many of the older images of it and you get that idea of how it fit in with the skyline. And again, I have to ask myself, what exactly did Chicago look like before it was unaltered? How did all these buildings truly fit together? And look at this particular proposal. It looks like a very large column that was a building. Now, in the past, we could dismiss that as a design, but after what we've seen in our explorations, can we? Can we truly? Very interesting that so many old buildings survive in Chicago, but I wonder, is it because they have the modern buildings that they could conceal them with? Because it seems as though that's what they're doing. And here you can see the entryway with that map, which does include the very well depicted Great Lakes in it, but strangely enough, I have to ask questions on another image and look at the walls and the reliefs in the walls and then the inscription all around the windows and the entryway to the door. And once again, you could find yourself some good living space in this incredible building, probably for a very low and economical and fair price, as this is Chicago. And in all cities, they have very good standards of living and very easy prices. Birthplace of Colonel Robert R. McCormick. Birthplace? So was he actually born here in this building, or was his incubator simply located in the building? Well, I'm not sure, but we'll continue on. And look at the balcony and the ornate detail. And what exactly is the purpose behind this? How did you pull all this off in 2 years? And what's the point of putting all this on a building? It's beautiful, it's detailed, but they needed that? You look at other images and other perspectives of this building and you can see that there is some way that it seems to stand out. Almost as though that this building was definitely from the high time, the pinnacle of the civilization that preceded ours. And yet at the same time, we know that there were certainly much greater buildings, and we'll be exploring those. Well, I leave you off with a very convincing construction photo. I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.